Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. In today's episode, we answer the question, is modern poker training making players worse? We'll dive deep into the evolution of poker strategy, contrasting the solver era with the gritty, intuition-driven days of old-school poker. If you've ever questioned whether staring at solver output actually builds skill, or if you're a newer player wondering what you're missing by skipping the fundamentals, this conversation is for you. You'll explore the differences in mindset, skill development, and training styles between players who came up pre-solvers versus those learning in today's data-driven environment. From HUD stats and note-taking to combo counting and population data, this episode breaks down what skills have been lost, what's been gained, and what makes for a truly well-rounded poker player in today's games. With that said, here's Coach Weasel to break it all down. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is Old School Poker. We're going to be thinking about the way that the skill set of a poker player who started playing in the last 5 years is going to differ from the type of skill set that poker players have who perhaps started playing 10 years or more ago. And we're going to do this by breaking poker down into two different eras. And the current era we'll refer to as the solver era. It's characterized by a general obsession with GTO. Analyzing solver output, analyzing pre-solved solutions. The majority of poker discussions you see will involve looking up a GTO solution to that situation at some point. And there is a chance that if you started playing poker in the last few years, the first thing that you would have done is maybe get access to some type of GTO output. It could be pre-solved pre-flop ranges. It could be a tool for solving post-flop situations or a tool that gives you access to pre-solved post-flop situations. And it's perhaps being presented to you as this is the way that you learn poker, and you use that to construct your strategy. The problem that this can generate is that it's the only point of reference for some new players. Everything is to do with GTO. And there are certain skill sets that old school players would have picked up with thinking about the poker industry pre-solver. And those particular skill sets, newer players potentially never develop because the only thing they're doing is looking at solver output. Now, the thing that I wonder about is whether this is the first generation where the caliber of the average new poker player has decreased. We've seen throughout history that poker players are presumably becoming stronger at the game. And in this podcast episode, we're going to reference some of the earlier days of poker where some of the ideas we had about strategy were really quite bad. Even professional players had some hugely confused ideas about the way that the game was supposed to be played. And what we've seen from the darker ages of poker going forward is what might be a general progression towards becoming stronger on average. But some of the ways that players think about poker or some of the things that they do in the solver era leads me to wonder whether for the most part this is really a step forward or whether it's actually a step backwards. You see, to contrast this with the first era of poker, and admittedly, this is a very broad era, and within that era itself, there were many upgrades that players made to the way that the game is played. We're going to refer to this as the exploitative era. You see, if we go back to a time pre-solver, the objective of a poker player was simply to win and make the most money. And that had to be an exploitative style. It couldn't really be a GTO style because no one knew how GTO was supposed to be played. In fact, you could argue that even now, even post-solver, still the vast majority of players don't really know how GTO is supposed to be played. We certainly don't have a complete solution to the game at this stage. But back in the earlier days of poker, think a decade ago or more, the goal was simply to win and make the most money, and that had to be an exploitative style. Use of HUDs was very important. Player profiling was very important as well. There was definitely a belief that Hold'em or poker in general, it's not about the cards you're dealt, it's about the opponent and how they play. Play the player, not the cards, etc. And I'm not saying that's completely gone from poker, but if you think about the way that a player thinks about solver output, generally, by definition, if we're using a solver, it doesn't take into account anything to do with opponent type or player profiling. The assumption is that our opponent is a perfect GTO opponent. So often the importance of player profiling is completely ignored when having a GTO-based discussion on poker. Note-taking was also extremely important and emphasized in the earlier days of poker. And although I don't think note-taking is that relevant in the modern era, I do think player profiling is very important. And that was the idea behind note-taking, to build up a picture on exactly how our opponent played and their tendencies. Seeing as we didn't have access to solver output, poker players heavily relied on their intuition. The correct play was unprovable in many situations. So you would have some players saying, actually, this is the best play in this spot. You should fold against the 3-bet here pre-flop, for example. Whereas you'd have another player saying, no, I actually don't think that's the right play. You should be defending this hand as a 3-bet. And it was impossible to prove who was right. Everyone had their own viewpoint, but this viewpoint was really based on intuition and experience. It wasn't something that could be proved one way or another. And if you wanted to be a winning player, you needed to have a very strong intuition. You'd be in a certain situation and you would just have a feeling regarding what the correct play was. And for strong winning players, their intuition would be right more often than it was wrong. And once again, I don't want to say that players don't use their intuition in the modern era, but if everything's something that can be proven and demonstrated because it's solver output, then there's certainly a lot less need to focus on an important quality such as intuition as a poker player. Now let's just focus on a couple of those areas. Usage of HUDs. If you go back to the earlier stages of online poker, using a HUD was a key aspect of differentiating a pro versus a recreational player. So the professional players used HUDs, the recreational players didn't. It's one of the ways that they generated their edge. And if you go back to the earlier stages in online poker, you'll see entire training courses dedicated to the use of a HUD. So the course would be go through every aspect of the game tree, and it would literally be a case of, okay, flop c-bet node. If your opponent's fault to c-bet is above this value, then you should c-bet very aggressively as a bluff. If it's below this value, then you should weight your range towards stronger made hands. And the entire course would be a professional player going through every node in the game tree, talking about relevant HUD stats and what we were looking for in terms of high or low values. In other words, that was how poker was played. It was a game that was played with a HUD, looking for values that deviated from the correct statistic, which provided exploitative opportunities. And then the way that we would go about exploiting those inaccurate statistics, again, wasn't so much something that was proven. We did have access to earlier tree building tools like Card Runner's EV, but those are very difficult to use for what we can refer to as EV modeling. It was often down to a player's intuition to figure out exactly how the strategy should adjust based on a villain stat that was too high or too low. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't recall the last time that I've seen a training series released where everything is focused around HUD use. The main types of training video I see in the industry are either live play. That's something that's been consistent over the last 2 decades or so, which is live play training videos have always been very, very popular. And then the other type of training video I see is someone clicking through pre-solved GTO solutions, or in some cases, maybe they've run the solve themselves. They're using PioSolver or GTO Plus, for example. I don't really see so much in terms of the way of theory videos being released in the modern era, and I don't see a lot in terms of using HUDs, player profiling. Everything is very solver oriented, even in the training industry. So we've moved from an era where the most important decision point in any hand of poker was the relevant HUD stat, to now the most important decision point is what is solver doing in this scenario. Note-taking was also heavily emphasized. There were many training courses that focused heavily on taking notes on opponents, which is all part of opponent profiling, which by extension is part of exploitative play. We take notes because our opponents are clearly deviating from correct play in one way or another. So we take a note on that, we generate the relevant exploit. Here's another example of a skill set that earlier poker players would have, which is maybe a little bit lost. And it's something we can refer to as combo counting. Now, to give you an example of what I saw working at one poker stable, and this was figuring out whether we should bluff or bluff catch. And there was a very specific system that the stable wanted us to use to teach the students in terms of whether they should bluff or bluff catch in a certain river scenario. And the steps were as follows. Step number 1, enumerate the entirety of villain's range. So basically, we'd go all the way back to pre-flop, decide on the pre-flop range, we'd look at the flop action, we'd narrow our perception of villain's range, usually using a tool like Flopzilla or Power Equilab or just regular Equilab as it may have been back then. By the time we get to the river, the idea is we have an idea of exactly what our opponent's range looks like to the specific combo. Then based on that, we decide which combos he's likely to bluff with and at which frequency. So therefore we can figure out what types of hands have the right equity to bluff catch. Or in terms of value betting, we would do the opposite. We'd have a look at our opponent's range, we'd decide what we think he's calling against the bet with, and if we have enough equity against that calling range, we make a value bet. Now, as it turns out, there are actually some serious problems with this approach to strategy. And that's because even if we are able to figure out our opponent's precise river range, which is already not really that likely, but let's just say for argument's sake we can get close, we still have no way of knowing which combos he's actually going to bluff with. Give you a simple example, if our opponent reaches the river with, let's say, 8 combos of busted gut shot, how do we know whether he's going to bluff them or not? Just because they're bluff candidates doesn't mean we automatically know whether he will always bluff all of his gut shots, whether he'll bluff them 50% of the time, or whether he'll never bluff them. The other thing that I find really ironic about this, looking back, this is a stable and players sign up to a stable so that they can be told what the correct play is. And the response in this case was just to say to the players, well, count the combos and figure it out. We're not going to tell you what to do. Put your opponent on a range and then figure out whether you should be bluff catching against that. It's ironic because you might imagine that's actually the stable's job to tell you what to do. Whereas in the earlier days of online poker, it was, well, here's how you figure it out. Go ahead and figure it out. Now, if we compare this to what stables do in the modern era, they generally just tell their players what to do. So it could just be a case of you 3-bet pre-flop, always c-bet every flop for 1/3 pot, and then barrel XYZ turn cards for this sizing, barrel these other turn cards for this sizing, and then check the rest. And that's it. It's a system that players can follow. Now, that's certainly easier to execute on a basic level. We don't need to be messing around with counting combos. But then, although the process of counting combos was flawed, at least it gave players the experience of envisioning their opponent's ranges directly. So it may not have been effective at figuring out what the best play was, but it did provide experience with manipulating the raw materials that are used to make decisions as a poker player. In other words, ranges and combos. And if you're part of a modern stable and you're simply clicking buttons in the way that you've been told to by your instructors, you're not developing those abilities to think like a poker player, work with those raw materials, and at the same time develop your intuition as a player. So are modern stables more effective at producing big crushers? Well, you could certainly argue that they are, but are they more effective at developing well-rounded players who know how to think about the game, form calculations, and develop their intuition? You could argue that we've actually taken a step back in terms of the development of a modern poker player. Now, there is another side to this, and that is, although there are clearly some steps backward that we've taken on the whole, it's worth keeping in mind that there was a dark side to the earlier eras in online poker. Here are some examples. We used to have pre-solver, many players at least, ridiculously tight big blind defense ranges and defend versus 3-bet ranges. To give you an example, we have something like King Jack offsuit in the big blind, and we face a 3 big blind button open. Many players would have contended that that was a fairly straightforward pre-flop fold from the big blind. And the reasoning was that King Jack was easily dominated. If we flopped a pair of jacks, could be dominated. If we flopped a pair of kings, could be dominated. Of course, from a modern theory perspective, we know the idea of folding King Jack offsuit from the big blind against a button open is fairly insane. In terms of defense versus 3-bet, I definitely remember pre-Black Friday, so we're talking really earlier stages of online poker, having some fairly intense discussions on whether it was correct to defend something like 10-9 suited on the button when facing a 3-bet from the blinds. We're not even talking a large 3-bet, we're talking 3 big blind button open, small blind, 10 big blind 3-bet. Should we defend 10-9 suited? Many players would have told you that it's just incorrect to defend suited connectors pre-flop because there is not enough stack depth left behind to justify defending based on implied odds. In other words, you absolutely cannot call 10-9 suited in that situation because there aren't enough chips left to win behind, given that we don't make a straight or a flush very often. Of course, once again, from a modern theory perspective, we know that we absolutely have to defend something like a premium suited connector on the button when facing a fairly small 3-bet from the blinds. Another example is that the majority of players were completely shackled by the value bet bluff paradigm. Everything either had to be a value bet or a bluff. There was no room for anything in between. We of course now know that that's a completely incorrect way of thinking about the game of poker. To give you a simple example, imagine a spot where small blind open raises pre-flop and we have something like H-Jack in the big blind. Is it okay to 3-bet in that spot? Now, if you take a look at solver, it's actually a combination that's mixed. You can flat or you can 3-bet. But if you apply early poker logic to that situation, the way players would analyze it is to have a look at the continuing range against the 3-bet and see whether ace-jack had over 50% equity. The reasoning was, if ace-jack offsuit doesn't have over 50% equity when our opponent calls, then it's not okay to 3-bet that combo because it's not extracting value. It's only okay to 3-bet holdings that have over 50% equity against our opponent's continuing range. Unless, of course, we're bluffing, because we did know about polarized ranges back then. So it wasn't okay to 3-bet ace-jack offsuit, but it may have been okay to 3-bet something quite a bit weaker in that scenario. Of course, we now know that that's not how poker works. There are all of these reasons in between value betting and bluffing for betting, and equity denial is a very important part of the game, something we understand now, but we didn't understand in the darker ages of online poker. Players did used to talk about GTO in the early parts of poker. It was still a thing. It's just that we didn't have access to solver output. But there were many players who would still talk about GTO and use GTO as a reason for taking certain actions. But if you go back and analyze some of the earlier conversations regarding GTO, it's clear that it's an area that was hugely misunderstood. And it's not always clear whether players were really actually improving their game by attempting to play GTO pre-solver. I'll give you a simple example of respected coach at the time who made a training video or a training series. And all of the decisions in the hand history review sections were made based on the range versus range equity. So not only does that have the problem of realistically, we probably don't know what our opponent's range is anyway, like we mentioned with combo counting. But even if we did, even if we allow for a minute that this coach had near perfect vision over villain's exact range and also hero's exact range, we know that the range versus range equity is really not the most important determining factor in deciding how often we're supposed to bet and which types of bet sizing we use. It's actually more to do with the equity distribution, but that wasn't a concept that you would ever hear being discussed back then. And it's quite amazing, really, watching a coach from 10 years ago talk about all of these spots through a GTO lens, purely looking at range versus range equity and making out that that's the only thing you really need to know in order to justify various different types of decision. Completely incorrect application of GTO poker. So that's one of the dark sides as well, is that if anyone was trying to play GTO, it was even worse back then than it is now. Another big advancement as well is our access now to population data. We know a lot more about what the average poker player does than what an average poker player would have done earlier on, because we didn't have access to population data. So now when we talk about a typical river bluff situation, we can say things like, I'm going to bluff in this spot because according to the pool data, the average player folds above 50% of the time. Whereas pre-population analysis, that same analysis would go, I think my opponent's probably folding this frequency because this is the range of hands I put him on, and I'm guessing that he's going to fold these hands out of that range, which is going to produce this folding frequency. A little bit like the combo counting we described earlier. Part of the reason why we had to combo count, or part of the reason why many schools used that as their methodology, was because we didn't have access to population data and we didn't have access to solver output. So how are we supposed to figure out how often our opponent is folding, unless of course we have a HUD stat? But assuming we don't have that, well, we then just need to put our opponent on a range and then make some fairly speculative assumptions about which parts of that range is going to fold or not. So you can see it wasn't all fantastic in the earlier parts of online poker. There were many wildly incorrect approaches to the game of poker. And we have to say that these aspects of the game, at least, have improved. If you take a modern player, even if they jump straight into solver work, you can quite easily say that their pre-flop strategy is going to be better than, let's say, a professional player who was just playing based on intuition 10 or 15 years ago. So there are clearly some advantages to what the old school players were doing, but there are clearly some drawbacks as well. So this brings us to the ideal poker player. And if we just ignore things like bankroll management and mindset, in my mind, this is the list of abilities that creates the ideal poker player in the modern environment. So firstly, they are an exploitative player. That means that even if they do GTO analysis, they are committed to generating the max exploit strategy. They do use solvers. So ideally, you should work with a solver. It is an important part of your development. But solver work is purely one aspect of our exploitative analysis. In other words, we work with solvers to increase our understanding of exploitative play. This is not an excuse to avoid solver work. Just because you're an exploitative player doesn't mean you don't need to look at solvers, period. It's still important. You will also have, as an ideal player, a strong understanding of HUD stats, how they work. You'll have a good HUD setup, and you'll also pay a lot of attention to player profiling. How to play against nits, tags, lags, maniacs, donks, fish, All the different types of opponent, however you label them, you will know how to play against them and have different strategies depending on your opponent type. You will have access to pool data and you'll understand how EV calculations work and have the ability to run, at least on a basic level, EV models. So really slightly more complex EV calculations that help us figure out whether one line generates the highest EV based on pool data or a second line. And finally, you'll have built up a level of intuition. I don't believe that we can simply learn to play very good poker by trying to mimic solver output. I think poker players need an intuitive feel for what types of plays make sense, an intuitive feel for when their opponent is strong or weak, and how to generate a counter response to that, even if the precise correct response is not known. So intuition is extremely important for poker players, and they allow us to navigate through zones that are not clear. Some zones are fairly clear from a theory lens. Yes, you should defend king jack offsuit against a button open. That's fairly clear. You don't need intuition for that. But some spots are going to be a lot closer, and if you can find yourself consistently on the right side of close spots as a result of your intuition, that's going to be very, very good for you in the long run. And that's something that early poker players had. You needed to have that, otherwise you would not have survived. Now, the reason why that I say perhaps poker players are of a lower caliber in the last few years, at least newer poker players, is because when you compare my list of ideals to, let's say, a player who comes into the industry and immediately starts working with solver output. Here's the list of ideals again, but based around a player who jumps straight into solver work and tries to play GTO poker. So item 1 in the list, are they an exploitative player? No, they're trying to play GTO. Do they work with solvers? Yes, they do. So this is a good aspect of an ideal poker player. Do they have a strong understanding of HUD stats and player profiling? Well, we have to say no. Solver work doesn't teach that, and a lot of training content doesn't focus on HUD use anymore. So we have a new generation of players who just jump into games without even running a HUD. They feel they don't need a HUD because they are following solver output. Access to pool data and EV modeling. Some GTO players may have a look at pool data, but assuming a player is just focused on GTO output, then they're not interested in pool data and they're not interested in EV modeling. Finally, poker players' intuition. I wouldn't say that working with solver is going to build your intuition, because if anything, it's going to convince you that your opponent is playing in a way that's not really representative of how he's actually playing. Intuition is something that's built up through playing a lot of volume and making connections. When my opponent makes this type of sizing in this type of spot, he likely has this type of range. Now, if we take the same list, but compare it to a Dark Ages exploitative era player. So starting at the top of the list again, is he an exploitative player? Yes, because that would have been the only thing he would have known. Does he use solver? Well, Dark Ages players wouldn't have had access to a solver. So let's assume that this player doesn't have the ability to run a solver. Strong understanding of HUD stats and player profiling? Absolutely. This is something that was intrinsic to the way that poker players worked on their game. Access to pool data and EV modeling. This really depends. We have had tools like CREV for over a decade, as far as I'm aware. Pool data appeared sometime in the middle of the exploitative era. So an early poker player may have had access to pool data or maybe not. And then finally, poker players' intuition. Well, we'll say yes, that was very important to the way that an early poker player approached the game. So you can see out of the list of 5 there, the exploitative era player perhaps marks 3 or 3.5, whereas the modern GTO solver-oriented player only checks one of the 5 boxes. So this is why I asked the question at the outset. I wonder whether the solver era that we've entered is really producing strong players, or whether it's actually bringing down the average caliber of a new poker player. But either way, the idea is the same, and that is the ideal poker player actually has all of the skill set. So yes, they do work with solvers. They understand the modern movement and are able to extract value from solver work, but they also have access to the skill set that exploitative era players would have had as well. And as a result, they end up having the complete list. So they deliberately play exploitatively. They do work with solvers. They understand theory, but they use it to improve their exploitative game. They can still use HUD stats to a very high level. They have a great HUD setup. They understand player profiling. They make full use of pool data and EV modeling. And they also have that intuition that they've built up over a long period of time. If you check all of these 5 boxes, then in my mind, you're well on your way to becoming the ideal player. So really another way of saying this is that the modern day syllabus is potentially incomplete, and there's still quite a bit that we can learn from old school poker players. They're aware of a few tricks that aren't often covered in modern training material. All right, hopefully this has given you something to think about so you can round out your game, become a stronger player. Thanks very much for listening. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.